Spearhead from Space is often quoted as one of the all-time great classic Doctor Who stories, and let's be honest, most of that has to do with the Autons. But that is not to say the story has nothing else going for it. On the contrary, I feel the historical significance of this serial and what it manages to accomplish is also often overlooked. And to fully appreciate what I mean by that, we need to really examine Spearhead from Space in its context. Anyone who's seen Adam Martin's recent video on the viewing figures of Season 6, which I strongly recommend by the way, will know that Doctor Who was in a bad way by the end of 1969. Due in part to increasing competition from American imports, ratings were falling because yeah, that's not a new thing, and there was talk of the show being cancelled altogether. Ultimately, Doctor Who narrowly avoided the axe, however its budget would be slashed, and the show would become Earthbound since alien planets were deemed too expensive and were off the table. Thanks to the Russell T Davies era, we are now very much used to the idea of the Doctor being the defender of Earth, fighting off alien invaders week in, week out, but it's easy to forget that that wasn't always the case. The early years of Doctor Who were all about faraway adventures in distant galaxies or ancient history. It wasn't until Season 3, that's right, Season 3, that we actually witnessed the first contemporary Earth invasion story with the War Machines. Even though Patrick Troughton's era made more use of the present-day format, the notion of removing the TARDIS and confining the Doctor to Earth was, in the 1970s, as good as taking the Who out of Doctor Who, and it could have so easily been the final nail in the coffin for the series, especially when viewers would also have to acclimatise to a new actor in the lead role on top of everything else. The introduction of Jon Pertwee's incarnation of the Doctor is one of the most important things which the serial gets right, since it would only serve to further alienate viewers if they did not immediately warm to the character. I always find the strongest post-regeneration stories are the ones where it's evident both the writers and actor have a clear idea of who they want the new incarnation to be. The Doctor actually spends roughly the first third of Spearhead from Space immobilised in a hospital bed, similar to in the Christmas Invasion 3 decades later. But just like in the Christmas Invasion, once the third Doctor is up and on his feet again, we get an immediate sense of exactly who he is. There's a very underrated scene in Part 2 where the Doctor turns up in a stolen vehicle at UNIT's secret headquarters, which he shouldn't even know the location of at this point, and before the officer on duty can even get a word in, he loudly declares he doesn't have a pass and demands to see Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart. Quote-unquote "I am the Doctor" moments are something generally attributed to the modern era, but I would argue even though he doesn't use those words and actually refuses to give his name, this is the first ever "I am the Doctor" moment in Doctor Who. This is basically everything the third Doctor is about, from his rebellious anti-authoritarian nature to his ability to take control of situations through sheer force of personality distilled in one brief scene. From this moment on, it's clear the new Doctor has arrived, and he is able to blend in seamlessly with the new status quo. This has a lot to do with Robert Holmes' streamlined and efficient storytelling, using the period in which the Doctor is out of action to re-establish UNIT, last seen in the Invasion, and introduce the fractious relationship between the Brigadier and his new scientific advisor, Liz Shaw. Even though the purpose of UNIT had already been explained when they appeared in the previous season, it makes sense to treat the audience as though they'd never heard of it before, since this story lends itself to being a jumping-on point for new fans with the new Doctor and revised format. I find it interesting that while the Doctor rants about being trapped on Earth, he never once references the Time Lords by name, or any of the events from the War Games for that matter, almost like the show wanted to draw a thick line under its past and start afresh. And that would make sense considering how drastically different the tone of this season in particular is compared with everything that had gone before. I already talked about the grim, gritty realism of Season 7 in my review of Inferno, and while I think it comes across more in subsequent stories, particularly the Ambassadors of Death and the aforementioned one with the eye patch, it is also present here with an industrial location along with some brutal murder scenes at the hands of the Autons. It also probably helps that Spearhead from Space was recorded entirely on film with no studio work due to strike action at the BBC. Speaking of the Autons, although I said in the intro about how they tend to overshadow other significant aspects of this story, there is a reason why they are so memorable. I'm hardly the first to say it, but you simply cannot review Spearhead from Space without acknowledging ending, there is something viscerally creepy about shop window dummies coming to life as a concept. Not to mention making everyday inanimate objects scary is just something quintessentially Who-ish no matter what era of the show we're discussing. Something that often isn't given so much credit though is Hugh Burden's understatedly spine-chilling performance as Channing, who provides a face and a voice for the Nestene consciousness. If there's one aspect of Spearhead from Space that doesn't quite work, it's the ending. Plenty has already been said about the final appearance of the Nestene consciousness and Pertwee's face-pulling, but it's more than dodgy visual effects that make this conclusion feel unsatisfying. For one, there are plot strands that go nowhere, like how the Nestenes have built waxwork replicas of high-ranking politicians to replace their real-life counterparts, which are seen leaving the museum and then never heard from again. Incidentally, if you're curious what happened to them, I recommend checking out the novelisation of this serial by Terence Dix, which basically explains how the government try to respond to the crisis but are unable to since half of them have been replaced by Autons. Then there's the resolution itself, which involves Liz and the Doctor building a machine which kills the Nestenes, and that's it. There's no payoff here where the Doctor or another character does something clever which saves the day. There's no setup, it just feels kind of cheap. The obvious comparison to make is with the Series 1 opener, where the anti-plastic which ultimately defeats the Autons is established very early on, but of course the climax is really all about Rose's character arc and her heroic moment when it seems all is lost. There are multiple layers to this ending, whereas with Spearhead from Space there are no real complications or twists in the tale. Yes, the Doctor gets a face full of tentacles, but that's really just a fleeting setback. All of that being said, it's not the worst ending I've ever seen, and it doesn't bring down the story as a whole. Spearhead from Space marks the first time in Doctor Who history the show was seriously forced to reinvent itself, and in doing so it proved the versatility of the format, and that versatility is a key ingredient in the programme's longevity. Doctor Who has lasted so long because it can be almost anything, frequently changing and renewing itself just like the titular character, and Spearhead from Space was the first time that was really put to the test. Without this serial, Doctor Who would never have had the sustainability to keep going for almost 60 years. I'm Midnight, and I travel in time and space, and trains.